Hello, everyone. My name is Corey Thornton. I'm the senior editor at Open Minds, and welcome to today's Circle Executive Roundtable, Mergers and Financial Sustainability, the Cornerstone Montgomery case study, featuring Cari Guthrie, President and Chief Executive Officer at Cornerstone Montgomery. She is joined by Dee DeWitt, Senior Associate here at Open Minds. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping reminders. Your audio is muted for today's briefing. However, we do encourage you to submit questions. You can use the question box located on the right side of your screen. And finally, the slides and the recording for today's roundtable will be archived and made available for elite members on the Open Minds website starting tomorrow. And with that, here's Dee.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's roundtable, and welcome, Cari. I'd like to go ahead and get started. We'll be talking about mergers and financial sustainability with Cari Guthrie, Chief Executive Officer of Cornerstone Montgomery. With that in mind, we have several learning objectives today that I'd like to underscore as we go forward. We'd like to really focus in on financial sustainability issues and the impact of merger and growth decisions, along with key financial sustainability issues when actually implementing a merger that's designed to scale an organization. Underpinning all of that is looking at key components and understanding key components of planning for financial sustainability and key financial strength metrics. I'd like to really start today with the last bullet point, understanding key components of planning and metrics, to lend context to our discussion with Cari. But before we move on, I would like to introduce Cari. Cari, welcome. Cari Guthrie is a licensed social worker. She's been in community mental health for over 30 years. Received her master's in social work from the University of Maryland, worked in Johns Hopkins Bayview and Threshold Services, where she grew to Chief Operating Officer. In 2012, Cari became CEO of Cornerstone Montgomery, which is the largest mental health services provider in that county. It serves over 2,400 people, and they just recently merged late last year with Southern Maryland Community Network, expanding to 4 counties and 3,000 clients. They've been a CCBHC since 2019, and Cari is a past board member of the National Council for Mental Wellbeing. So welcome, Cari.
Thank you.
With that, I'd like to focus on providing some context to today's discussion, and to start with that, I'd really like to focus on what are the drivers with regards to the need for financial strength. There are multiple drivers involved, and I'm sure that Cari has not experienced any single one of these. But the first driver is whole person care. The move in terms of our industry in health and human services overall, and in behavioral health and IDD particularly, are driving the need to invest in more technology, more data tools, more partnerships and mergers. And those sorts of things, all requiring cash. There's a shift in our business models from volume to value, which drives cash and the focus on managing financial risk, particularly downside risk. We talk about consolidators and disruptors a lot in organizations, and particularly more retail outlets and those sorts of issues coming into the behavioral healthcare space. However, I'd like to also point out that what I'm seeing just as much of are organizations like Cari's that are experiencing inroads being made from for-profit organizations that are not necessarily retail, but they're venture capital driven, that are coming in to take advantage of or leverage the demand for mental health and behavioral health services in our country post-pandemic. In addition to that, there are workforce and development issues. We talk about workforce inflation, the need for building pipelines. I know organizations now that are hiring simply to hire a licensed clinician, for example, when they can find a clinician as opposed to when there's a vacancy. That drives the demand for cash along with salary inflation. And then more competitive service models and the need for infrastructure and capital investments to drive that. What this really translates to is being thoughtful with regards to creating financial sustainability, which from my perspective means planning, implementation, and reporting. So to start with, does your financial plan does it align with your overall strategic plan that's been approved by your board and executive team? Once you make sure that your financial plan is well aligned with that, are you implementing key metrics and then following through with actually reporting and then acting on those reports with regards to your overall plan and plan of action? So what that means for me is, in creating a plan, we're really not talking about one plan, but we're talking about at least 4 different plans or budgets that need to be taken into consideration. There's the general operating budget, which I think we're all very well aware of. It's very interesting to me that I meet with a number of organizations that do not operate off of a multi-year capital budget. That's becoming more and more important and strategic, especially with the need for advanced planning and the need for cash planning associated with those investments. So a multi-year capital plan is critical to the overall creation of a financial plan. Cash flow budgeting is critically important as well, particularly as we see changing payment models in our industry today. One of the things that we've seen more of is an elongated payment cycle with regards to claims processing, for example. That in itself means the need for more cash and managing cash flow. One of the things that I'm very, very interested in personally and professionally is organizations that implement a 13-week rolling cash flow budget, for example, and then cash flowing projections going forward, and then a rolling forecast of overall operating results or profitability. Many times those need to be done on a quarterly basis, and that would be our recommendation. Underpinning the financial plan, though, those financial plans don't really mean a lot with regards to being able to successfully implement and realize those plans without some key underpinnings. The first of that is implementing key metrics. Operating metrics are some of the things that we talk about quite a lot. When we talk about those, we're talking about, for example, referrals to first service, 30-day and 7-day follow-ups. What is our utilization pattern overall? There's more and more talk every year, even though it's been talked about for the last 30 years, more and more talk about revenue producing staff openings, vacancies, particularly with the shift away from cost reimbursement and to other payment models. The revenue producing staff openings become critical because it's less about the cost and more about lost revenue. Productivity becomes an issue under these new payment models that impact the ability to actually earn and drive revenue and cash and financial strength. Financial metrics that assess organizational strength, like liquidity and performance ratios, debt leverage and process efficiency, we're going to go into in a little bit more detail in just a moment, but those are critical to implementing the financial plans and budgets. Assessment metrics are also important. What are the cost of capital? Can I afford that new building to expand my services? What is my return on investment, my ROI, for implementing a new service or program or location? What is my return when I'm thinking about implementing a partnership with a new organization or entering into an ASO model for shared savings, or going into a full merger as Cari and Cornerstone Montgomery has done? So those are some of the key issues and metrics that we need to bear in mind. Choosing those metrics can be critical with regards to success or failure, frankly. How to distinguish between financial data and reporting and external monthly reports. What are the external reports that you're required to give versus what are the critical reports that you need to manage on a daily and monthly basis? Financial teams and the executive team may rely on a certain set of reports, for example, while your team leaders and team supervisors that are in the trenches need a completely different set of reports. Those are critical in terms of making sure that those align with your overall financial plan, your budget, and that everybody's operating off the same page, even though they may need different sets of reports to do so. The monthly close and efficiency is key. Cari and I were just joking before we came online about it doesn't do her any good to get a monthly close report 30 or 45 days after the close. By then, it's too late to really efficiently implement needed changes without further harm. And again, at the last bullet point on this page, making sure that every staff member in the organization understands and knows about the metrics that are important for their success. So those are the types of things that we need to be thinking about as we think about financial strength, financial sustainability, and how that impacts our operations in today's landscape, and particularly so as we're changing our organization. For example, entering into a partnership or merger, and where that leads us. So the last part of this is really thinking about how you manage cash and credit. An efficient revenue cycle is becoming more and more important. I've seen recently a lot of organizations whose payment cycles are creeping up because of changing payment models, but it's also creeping up because of staff turnover. We've experienced that not just in the clinical side of our organizations, but also on the support side of our organizations. So we may not have as well-trained claims processing staff as we might have had 3 to 5 years ago even. Looking at liquidity measures and ratios that people outside the organization, how they view us is become critically important as well. The need going forward to have access to lines of credit, for example, as credit to even out cash flow during the course of a month or a quarter is become more and more important with our changing landscape and payment models. But then also access to credit or banking relationships for not only credit lines, but also other relationships that are necessary as we look to scale and grow as organizations. All those become critical. So with that in mind, I'd like to go back to, I had mentioned earlier in selecting key metrics, financial metrics. So we do have liquidity, performance, leverage, and process efficiency measures. And I'd like to just touch base on each of those for just a moment, again, to set the context of things that we really view as critical as we discuss and think about financial planning, financial strength, and how that is impacted in the day-to-day life of our organizations in today's landscape, but also how it's impacted as we enter into change like Cari has with regards to growing their organization and having a merger, a full-on merger. So liquidity measures. Liquidity measures look at mostly short-term and what is your ability as an organization, your financial strength to measure short-term demands or weather them. For example, in California, there's a very large changeover right now from cost reimbursement and invoicing in the Medi-Cal, Medicaid realm to fee-for-service, which implies a shift away from invoicing and a shift towards claims and claims processing. That claims and claims processing implies not only just simply a change in process, but the fact that submittal of claims also mean denial of claims and then resubmittals. So if your organization, for example, is billing out $4 million a year, $4 million a quarter. I'm sorry again, try it third time. $4 million a month. If you're billing out $4 million a month in California, for example, in invoices, and you know you're going to get paid $4 million every month, and you change to fee-for-service claims, what if your denial rate is 10%? And you're used to billing out $4 million a month, receiving $4 million a month. Now all of a sudden you receive $3.6 million. What does that do to you in terms of your accounts payable ability, your ability to meet payroll, those sorts of things? That's why working capital, current ratios, and cash on hand are really important. Working capital is simply current assets over current liabilities, and then the ratio of that is current ratio. We recommend, and this is an industry benchmark, of at least 2.0 for your current ratio. That's $2 in current assets for every $1 in current liabilities, with current assets and current liabilities being assets or liabilities that are converted to cash and or are due within a year or less. Cash on hand has become a very important conversation lately with the changes in our industry and payment models, and with growth that has been the focus on many organizations. We used to recommend 60 to 90 days of cash, and you notice here we say that that's still recommended, but that's to cover operating needs. We're now shifting and starting to recommend 150 to 180 days of cash on hand for overall needs. And the rationale for that is 60 to 90 days of cash on hand to meet your day-to-day operating needs, and another 60 to 90 days of cash on hand to meet the needs that you may face with regards to financial sustainability and growth. For example, with changing payment models and changing payer demands, the need to invest in technology. That technology is expensive, and we all know that. So just using that as simply just one example, the need to be able to successfully invest in that without that harming your overall financial position is critical. We mentioned earlier developing pipelines for workforce because of the workforce issues that we're facing. That may mean bringing on staff that are not going to be productive initially in order to actually have the staff that you need overall. Those are just a couple examples of why cash on hand has become important. Performance analysis measures such as net margins, revenue and expense growth, and administrative ratios are becoming critical. We strongly recommend as an organization that health and human services organizations reach for a goal of 5 to 10% of a net surplus each year. A lot of organizations break even. Some organizations are hurting financially. Actually, it's very few organizations that are meeting a 5% threshold with regards to surplus. They're in the vast minority at this point in time. And usually they're the much larger organizations at this point, below $50 million in revenue. Organizations, quite frankly, are struggling with the demands for overhead, investments in technology, workforce issues, and those sorts of things. The revenue and expense growth, managing those go hand in hand. If you notice the chart in the middle with expenses in the green, this particular organization over time has been able to shift to better realign their expenses. So the gap now is a positive gap rather than a negative gap. The administrative ratio has become critical as well. 22% is rather high. Really 18% or lower is more of an industry benchmark that most organizations are looking at. Leverage analysis measures. What are the ratio of assets to liabilities and your ratio of debt to equity? Some of the important things here to think about are, two of the important things are, what are the actual ratios and what are the trends? In this particular instance, both of the trends are positive. On the left-hand side, it's going up, which you want it to do. You want to see more assets relative to your liabilities. And on the right-hand side, it's going down, and that's good because you want to see fewer debt as a measure of your equity. So in both of these cases, we recommend at least 2 to 2.5 to 1. But these are the types of things that we strongly recommend that not just the CEO and the CFO become comfortable in talking about, but the entire executive team, and that these become a part of everyday review. Cash conversion ratios, I'd like to focus on that for just a second. They're very critical with regards to that. It's basically a measure, the top line, the dark line, is a measure of how quickly do you take a service, turn it into a claim, and turn that claim into cash. And we recommend, as an industry benchmark, 30 to 45 days. And frankly, we'd recommend trying to get it as close to 30 days as possible, knowing that there's upward pressure with regards to payers on all levels, pushing out those payment streams to longer and longer cycles. So the better position that you are now with regards to that, as time goes by, the better position you will be to take on that added pressure. One of the things that's really important is to focus on that bottom line, the teal line, which is your payables. And the reason that I point that out is important to this whole issue of cash position, financial sustainability, and so forth, is how you manage actually your outflow of cash. I was working with a client recently where the bottom line, the payables line, was averaging 3 to 4 days, which told me that as soon as a bill arrives, they're paying it. If they could move that up and pay it when it's due, that could buy them a half to almost a month's worth of additional cash on average. That's a lot of money for an organization that may be $50 million in annual revenue. So managing that bottom line in terms of your payables, your outgoing payables, becomes very critical as well. With that, hopefully that set the stage a little bit for a robust conversation. I'd like to turn it over to Cari and have Cari introduce Cornerstone Montgomery. And Cari, just tell me when you'd like to advance the slides, and I'm happy to drive for you.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm just going to kind of go through, and we have some slides, and I'm really just going to tell our story about where Cornerstone has been and why we decided to do a merger and how that's going, basically. And there were definitely surprises along the way, all things that really, what Dee's been talking about, have been part of our conversation as we've gone through this process. So Cornerstone has been around for about 50 years. We were serving one county in Maryland, just north of DC, Montgomery County, and we were serving people ages 13 and up with mental health and substance use disorders. We had the full, pretty much almost the full range of services, from residential to clinic, all the things, and we were, going strong up until COVID. And then we were working with our clinic. Our clinic has historically been our loss leader by hundreds of thousands of dollars. We budgeted to lose money, knowing that other programs like residential and supported employment would easily make up the difference. And we were really pushing, right before COVID, we were talking about productivity, and we even laid out a whole plan to the prescribers and the therapists at the clinic about what the productivity expectations were going to be. And we probably did that in February of 2020. And then in March of 2020, COVID happened. So I will say that kind of put a freeze on that conversation, because as you all know, we were all basically just trying to stay viable and in business at that point. And we all had to pivot and do, virtual and all those things that we've all had to deal with the last 4 years. So, we were having these conversations, we were talking about it, we were really trying to focus on the clinic. We had a new medical director, we were trying to get things going, but honestly, COVID really kind of hit the pause button for the clinic, and that led to some other things that we'll talk about. Next slide. This just talks about who we are, how long we've been around. We're CARF accredited. Before the merger, we were about a $28 million organization. Next slide. We were located, like I said, in Montgomery County, just north of DC. We had 3 what we call hubs, 3 administrative offices, and then we also had another 80 properties, houses all around the county. So that's how we were. Next slide. This just describes our core services. In 2019, we did become one of the expansion CCBHCs. We're now in our 3rd SAMHSA grant, and we've used those funds to do things like get a new EHR and get more IT. A lot of the startup money for our ACT team was in those SAMHSA grants and some other things. So we've used that money for things that we needed that one-time cost support with, and that's been very successful. However, we still had ideas and thoughts about wanting to merge. So that's
Cari, if I may, one of your bullets here on this slide talks about services for persons with comorbid conditions and integrated care. I'm curious as to what you're seeing in terms of the industry move towards more integrated services.
So again, COVID kind of put a kibosh on that for us too. So prior to COVID, we had an FQHC co-located with us in 2 of our clinics. And in one of them in particular, it was the same FQHC, but we really had great interactions. There was collaboration, there was cross referrals. That FQHC partner did not provide behavioral health in those locations like they did in their other locations. So they allowed us to be that resource. And there was a lot of cross referral and everything going on. When COVID hit, they decided they needed to move out of those locations and bring people to their other sites. And they still haven't moved back yet. Now, in one of the locations, they've decided to permanently not come back. But in our other location, they kind of have to come back because of the money that we got to put them there. So they will be coming back, thankfully, in June. So we are now trying to rebuild that collaboration and that partnership to bring that back to what it was before. What's really cool about that particular location is that we're in that building, they're in the building as a tenant of ours, and then on the 1st floor of that building, we have a 70-bed women's shelter, and the county runs that, and they're our tenant as well. It's one of the reasons we could purchase the building, because we had such a tenant. So the beauty of it is we've got homeless, behavioral health, and primary care services all under one roof. And actually they have dental there too. So that's been a huge thing that we've missed this entire 4 years. And we're very excited to have it back. So we were really working, and it was going quite well. We actually do have in our 3rd SAMHSA grant money to start providing some primary care ourselves, but we're actually thinking of, now that the FQHC is coming back in, are we really going to do that right now? And we're looking at kind of restructuring what our plans were, but it's absolutely very important. We have behavioral health homes. We're tracking, all those co-occurring medical needs all the time. And Health Homes does well and has been a strong program, but that piece, that linkage with the services has definitely been something that we've felt the loss of the last 4 years.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Next slide. You can go again. So like I was saying, we were starting to struggle during COVID. Some of the things we had tried to put in place weren't happening the way we expected them to. Certainly that first year of COVID, we didn't have any staff leave. That was the lowest turnover we'd had in 50 years, I think, that year. But starting in 2021, as all of you know, the people started leaving and moving and re-examining their life and reprioritizing things, and we saw the same turnover and loss that everyone had. And that impacted many things, and we had the same with clients. So while we were struggling to stay, viable, we of course got the PPP money, and that kept us afloat. Honestly, I think getting that money was wonderful, but it also allowed us to, seeing that in the bottom line, hid the issues, hid the problems that we were having. At least we didn't see them as clearly as we should have. So when that money went away, this last year particularly, it became a bit of, we realized, oh, wait, what's going on, particularly at our clinic. So that was, has been a challenge coming out of COVID. So we had always wanted to expand beyond Montgomery County. We didn't want to be a one county show. We wanted to be more appealing to payers for value-based contracting, although I will certainly say in Maryland, that is a very limited prospect. We don't have a lot of value-based purchasing options in Maryland, although we're trying to change that with our state trade association, but it is a challenge, at least on the behavioral health side. On the medical side, it's a little easier. So that was something we were interested in. We knew that having a better geography, covering more lives, would do all of those things. I, was colleagues with the Southern Maryland CEO. She and I had known each other. We actually became CEOs within a year of each other and knew each other well. And she was actually exploring merging with someone else, and I thought that was happening. But then one day she called me in the middle of COVID and said, hey, that's not working out. What about you? You guys want to merge with us? And we started talking, and it really just made so much sense. They were much smaller. They were about 6 or 7 million. And she knew that there wasn't a viable situation to stay, around with things that were changing. And if there's a CCBHC, how would that work? And all of the things. And we started talking, and our cultures were actually very similar. Our missions were the same. Multiple of my management team would go down to Southern Maryland and talk to her staff and come back and say, it's just like talking to our staff. I mean, it was really very cool and a very good connection. And we both wanted that regional expansion, and really it was for some financial stability that we were looking at as well. As I said, we both were experiencing COVID program stressors. We were certainly seeing it in the clinic. We started to see it in supported employment, not a real big shock there. People weren't working as much, weren't looking for jobs, weren't hiring for a lot of the time. And we lost a lot of clients and staff during COVID in supported employment services. So those numbers were abysmal. Every year when we did the budget, we were trying to be as conservative as possible, but we really thought that some of those programs would bounce back a lot quicker than they actually did. I think we finally figured it out now, but it's taken 3 years. We also, if any of you are familiar with Maryland, we are a carve-out model, and we have an ASO that manages the carve-out. And right at the beginning of COVID, we got a new ASO, Optum, and it has been a nightmare for 4 years. Since day one, and it is still a nightmare. And we are counting down the days because Carolyn won the new contract. They have a 10-month transition, and we'll be saying goodbye to Optum at the end of this year. But that created also much drama and issues. Literally, they had to shut them down within 3 months of starting, and the state was paying us estimated payments based on the previous year's billing. That's what was happening in Maryland for about 9 months. Because we couldn't bill, they couldn't pay us. It was a nightmare. And honestly, it still isn't back to what it should be. Because then, of course, everyone was overpaid and we had to pay people back. It's been a nightmare. And that added to our financial bottom line. Thank goodness we got that PPP money, because that really did get us through a lot of this stuff. So we were trying to get some synergy, infuse ourselves with new services, some administrative savings, adding to the talent, the first question people asked us was, oh, if there's an opening in another county, can we apply for it now? And we were like, absolutely, of course, that would be part of this. So we were hoping, and then there would be some administrative savings, which that has played out over this last year. So there were all the things that you would think about with a merger that we were hoping for with this one. Next slide. So we were looking for a lot of these things, you know, contract leverage, as I mentioned. Serving 4 counties is efficient, you know, more persons covered, demonstrates value, it might be more appealing to payers. But we still had issues, you know, we still had concerns, the COVID impact. You know, some of these outcomes, we wanted to share strengths and programming. They did not have a clinic, which was probably a good thing because it probably would have been a loss leader as well. But we had clinics, they had targeted case management, which does very well financially. So that was a strong thing. They had just started an ACT program with a grant. So that was huge because we already had 2 ACT teams in Montgomery County, and both of us had residential crisis services. So there was so much crossover and similar things. Again, the missions were very similar, and even in many ways, the cultures were very similar. So we were able to have savings. You know, we did reduce costs. We were both using the same EHR. Now ours, we were new to our EHR, but it was the same one they were using, and that definitely was a transition. We had a newer version, so we brought their staff onto the Montgomery County version. We had the same version of financial software, but they had a much older version. So there was a lot of transition, a lot of things that we had to look at, but we were able to see some savings. We only had to lay off 1 person. We needed the support with this expansion of the people in their finance department. We needed the support. They had an IT, they had an outsourced contract, but we needed those resources for the transition. They were outsourcing HR, so we did add an HR person to our model, our programs, and we added an IT person. So we really tried to look at where we needed to add some support, but it ended up being a cost neutral because they had resources in their budget as well. So we were really trying to look at all of those things for sure. What I can say is some of the things that we saw, we didn't have a CFO for a while. In fact, we didn't have one when we officially merged. Our CFO resigned, and we were without one for probably 3 months. That was a challenge. And what that ended up meaning is, with Dee talking about financial statements and all of that stuff, we officially merged on April 1st of last year. We did not have joint financial statements until January of this year. And that was because we had 2 different financial systems. They were set up completely differently. We didn't have a CFO until the end of May last year. And when he came on board, you can imagine we were trying to get going with an audit. And we had to do 5 audits because we not only have the agency, but we have 4 HUD corporations that were also being audited. So he was neck deep in audits, and trying to merge the financial department was just not the #1 thing on the list. All the other departments, HR, IT, facilities, they were very smooth as part of the transition. They were amazing, but finance was the slowest. And the EHR billing department was also pretty slow, and now I'll talk about that in a minute. That wasn't all on us, and that was the state being a problem. But so it was really tough, and having those monthly statements, it was a problem. I mean, we got statements, but it was one for Southern Maryland and one for Montgomery County, and then you could try and mush them together. It was tough. And program directors, we had to keep referring them back to the budget. No, I know it doesn't say what the it doesn't have the comparison, but you know what your budget is. You set it up. You told us how much you'd bring in every month. We needed to remind people, go back to your numbers so that you can do the comparison yourself, because you're not going to see it in the financials until we get this joint thing happening. So I will say in January, we probably threw a party that finally happened, because that makes all the difference in the world when you see the numbers and it's right there, and it's just so much easier. So that is a huge deal, and it was a huge problem for quite a few months, obviously. So I would, definitely say that was something that happened. The other thing that happened is when we did the first budget for this fiscal year now, the joint budget, we had a deficit budget. We were going to go in with a flat budget, but I knew that we had to give frontline staff a raise. So I had the board I asked them for a deficit budget, and they gave us a deficit budget of about $400,000 so that we could give direct line staff raises. That was the only people that got raises. Oh, we also increased the base salary for those folks. But we didn't do it for anyone else, but that was what I could get from the board. I'd do it again, but I will say it has created issues with banks. They don't like a deficit budget when you're trying to ask for more money. And so that was, something that we saw happen. But like I said, I'd still do it again. We had to give those people raises. But it definitely created issues. Next slide. I think the next slide is just a map of now where we are. We used to just be up in Montgomery County. Now we have these 3 counties there in the south. Prince George's has a target on itself, but we're not quite ready to expand anymore. But certainly that is one of our next obvious places where we probably will go. Next slide. So really, this last slide, this really is about kind of the other unexpected things that happened. And really, because of COVID and because we, we're not conservative enough when we did our budgets. Cornerstone, the Montgomery part, had to reduce staffing pre-merger. We had to do layoffs, and it was mostly in our supportive employment team. We did reduce some hours in the clinic. With the clinic, when I finally was looking at numbers with the clinic, what I realized is that we had gone from 1,500 clients in our clinic to 1,000, and we still had the same staffing. Well, that's not going to work. So we had to look at that. And then I said, oh, look at all those productivity numbers we put in place before COVID. They weren't meeting them. They'd gotten very lazy. They'd gotten sloppy. I thought things were being looked at. I thought things were being addressed. They were not. So we have now a new chief medical officer. We have new management at the clinics because things were not happening that needed to be happening. People weren't looking at their productivity. People didn't understand productivity numbers. Volume was gone, and value, that was what they were concerned about. They wanted to make sure quality of care. So they thought by spending 45 minutes to an hour with every patient, that was providing quality. And I'm sure it was for many of the clients, but we couldn't afford. That's not the model we were doing. We are a community behavioral health center, and that was not the model. And we had to get people back online with what the productivity expectations were, including caseloads, number of services. We had to get people back online. And
Cari,
yeah.
if I may, just for clarity, the need to reduce staffing in that case, for example, you mentioned employment services.
Yeah.
That was really being driven by the COVID, post-COVID issues.
Yes.
Like employment services was a key cash cow for you.
Yes, they did not have enough clients, and we had too many staff. We did not bring in the clients we thought we would last year, and we had to reduce staff accordingly.
Yeah, but it wasn't a preparation for a merger. It was just right sizing.
Understandably so. That was really tough for staff to understand. They like, why are we merging then? And we're like, truly, this has nothing to do. This has to do with financial stability. Has nothing to do with the merger. We're actually hoping the merger brings us more financial stability. So yes, that was strictly COVID. The stuff going on at the clinic was COVID, plus the staff they did not understand budget. They did not understand productivity. And in fact, the second bullet on here, because they didn't understand those things, they felt they needed to unionize. So we have, of our 450 staff, we have 25 people from our clinic that are in a union now. And that's added a whole other level of things. Any change we want to make at the clinic now takes probably 4 times as long because we have to negotiate it. So that's been a challenge, and that certainly has affected the bottom line. We did restructure our clinic. But it took 6 months to negotiate that. I would have done it 6 months previously, but it took 6 months to get there. And we're now seeing the impact of that. So, COVID had a big part of this. People not understanding things not being explained, monitored like they should have been. And then it led to a union for this one particular part of the agency. As I mentioned earlier, we had issues with the state handling how did they want us to handle the NPI and MA numbers and authorizations? That was a disaster. Some of that was the new ASO, some of that was the state telling us one thing. Karen and I met with them, well prior to the merger and asked, what do you want us to do? And they said, do this. And then right beforehand, oh no, that's not right. You got to do this. So then we actually delayed the merger for 3 months because of it, because we weren't going to have the stuff we needed in time. So then we did it the new way, and that was still a challenge. So just, these unexpected things. I mean, cash flow and timing, I've mentioned that already, all those issues. We thought we were going to have things together, but we did not have the financial stuff together, and that was just a challenge. We weren't getting the information that we needed. I mean, we had it, but it was in pieces, and it was just made it not as quite as convenient or effective to see it that way. I don't know, we have an arrangement with our bank. When we bought our most recent building, it was financed by one bank, and they want all your other services and everything. So it was just very challenging. They had to sign off on the merger. That alone was probably at least $27,000 of legal costs because we had to pay for their lawyer. And then there were other things. They made us close down a line of credit that Southern Maryland had, but wouldn't expand ours. And it was just very challenging. And those challenges continue to happen. So, and part of that was, like I said, was the deficit budget, but not all. It was just banks and how challenging they can be. So that would be a challenge.
Pardon me, Cari. Did you have 2 different banks?
Mm-hmm. We had one, and Southern Maryland had one. We still have accounts with both, but that's going to be changing at some point.
So your bank remained the lead bank and the lender, and they're the ones who, in order to continue your line of credit, wanted you to shut down.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't expand ours, even though we were becoming a much bigger organization. So we're still arguing with them about that now. And then legally it was a merger, but financially our auditor said, oh, this isn't a merger, this is an acquisition. So we had to do all this assessment of all the buildings, the properties that Southern Maryland have. I will say, I was saying this to Dee ahead of this thing, that's fine with me, because let me tell you, our audited financials look awesome. We're $2 million in the black, which is so not true in terms of cash. And that's simply because they have buildings, property that's worth quite a bit of money. So banks like that and other people like that, but we know that that's not cash. So we're obviously working on, other issues with cash. But I had to kind of chuckle when we saw our audited financials, because it's definitely an issue. So I would just say, I want to obviously see if there's any questions, but when Dee was talking about all the data, the things that you look for, lost revenue was definitely our biggest problem that we didn't identify soon enough. Capacity, I knew some programs, they told me, Cari, we're struggling, but I was not getting the data and the information I needed from one program in particular, and that definitely created issues. So having that data and making sure you have the right people in place who are looking at that data is huge in terms of sustainability. Making sure, Dee mentioned it, staff understand the numbers to a point. Obviously they don't need to understand all the nitty gritty, but that they understand the productivity, they understand what is expected of them. Most of our teams do, but we had a team that did not, and that created many issues in a lot of ways. So I just think, we've definitely learned a lot of good lessons, but the merger was absolutely the best thing that we did. It did give us more resources. It did give us more in terms of cash flow. We've been doing fine in terms of cash flow. It was tight the first 6 months. We weren't sure what was going on, but the last 4 months, we've been fine with cash flow, no issues. We haven't had to tap into the line of credit. We've been it's been good. We're working on things, but it just takes time. I mean, all these things take time. But the merger was the right thing to do. Reducing staff before the merger also did what it needed to do. Our bottom line was better by the end of that fiscal year. But it's just an ongoing, obviously, conversation and work in progress.
So Cari, just a couple things. This has been really interesting to me, having gone through multiple mergers and acquisitions myself. One of the things when you were talking about the NPI MA numbers and authorizations, to me, that was a really great example of expecting the unexpected. That's happened to me on a number of occasions, the exact same thing. Whose number is going to survive, or are they both going to survive? I've had issues where, for example, in acquiring a program, well, in going through an acquisition where the organization, for all intents and purposes, represented one program and had one license, that the process of that acquisition meant that the license to operate the program had to be reapplied for and reapproved from the beginning under our organization that we're doing the acquiring.
Yep.
So going back to square one with an application for an existing program, there are a lot of boxes like that organizations, when they're considering merging or any kind of transaction like this, consolidation, that they would be well advised to seek out some advice with regards to exactly what they need to expect.
Well, and we did that. Our frustration was we met with the state people, we met with the Medicaid people, and they told us what to do months before we were merging. And we were doing what they told us to do. And then at the last minute, they said, oops, that's not what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, and that's the expect the unexpected part.
Yeah, exactly.
For anybody from the IRS who's listening in on the line, this would be like calling the IRS for advice in some cases.
Right. I mean, you just didn't know. And yeah, and then the ASO issues. I mean, none of our authorizations from supported employment transferred. So we had staff who had to input 600 authorizations.
Well, and from my perspective, one of the hidden costs on this is the cost of your time and your team's time.
Absolutely.
It's not just the delay or the input of authorizations, but it's taking you away from, in this case, rebuilding your company after COVID.
Right. Absolutely.
The other big bullet point, my takeaway is actually adding another bullet point to the screen. And that would be, again, my takeaway is really focusing in on the organizational culture and not leaving that to chance.
Yeah.
And I've been faced with many of those same issues too.
Right.
A lot of individuals, they don't understand what an acquisition or a merger is, and everybody looks at it from their own perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what is this going to do to me?
Yep. And I'm someone who really believes a lot in transparency, and I share I let people know everything. But what people were frustrated with, they still didn't understand why, or they wanted to, how was the decision made? They wanted to be part of the decision. It's been very interesting, like what some of this has brought up with people, and trying to, talk about how we get input about decisions and where the decisions are finally made lies with the board and the management team. And that's just been, and some people don't like that, don't appreciate that, don't want that. And so finding the new normal, I always say we're coming out of COVID, we find the new normal, a hybrid thing. Well, it's a new normal with a lot of things with COVID, communication, something I thought we were really good at. Now I'm like, okay, we got to change up how we're communicating and decision making. And I think, all of those things can impact your bottom line because, staff have questions they want to know. Can they do what they need to do? It's, yeah.
Another thing that I was thinking about too is your comment about, what you felt would be the appeal to commercial and other payers with expanded geography and population base, and yet being disappointed, not to put words in your mouth, but disappointed with regards to the lack of opportunity for value-based contracts at the moment.
Yeah.
And my feeling on that is that a lot of organizations go into strategic mergers or acquisitions looking to scale with the idea that once that happens, then other things will fall into place right away. And not thinking about it from the standpoint of, and I didn't hear this from you, but I'm taking your comment and extending it out.
Yeah.
And that is that, for example, the payer issue, that's actually an intermediate to longer term issue too. So strategically, my personal feeling is strategically from that perspective, you've done the right thing in terms of starting to scale, expanding geography, expanding your population base, and over time that will make you more attractive had you not done it. The issue that we're facing right now, I think, is the issue that a lot of people are facing, and that is everybody is talking about value-based care, but in many instances, it's the payers that are not ready for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think you'll be well positioned, having gone through the acquisition or the merger, and being multi-county now, compared to if you had not.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
Yes, I agree. The merger has been the best thing. I mean, there's no regrets there at all, and it's coming together, and it's been a good thing, and we're figuring out the other stuff too. So yeah.
There's one other big lesson that I've really appreciated from hearing your story, and that is that I think there's a lesson to be learned here in that an organization does not have to be the Bank of England to be able to enter into and to successfully do a merger and acquisition. You can have some challenges with your organization, and you've highlighted several that were a result of COVID and the pandemic, and yet still move forward with a merger and have it be considered a success.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think sometimes people that are struggling or see their organization struggle think that they can't do that, when in some cases that may actually be the best thing for them to do, even though it may be challenging.
Yep, it can be.
So, Corey, do we have any questions online?
Everybody's been pretty mute, but as you just said that, I believe one has just come in. Let me check. I want to thank Dee. I want to thank you and Cari both for today. This has been very educational. Okay, is there something you would do differently to make that? Oh, I'm sorry. Going forward, has Cornerstone been able to project when things will begin to turn around in your P&L? Is there something you can do differently to make that happen more quickly?
Well, we have done quite a few things actually. Like I said, we did completely restructure the clinic. It's something I would have done 6 months ago, but it didn't happen until the end of December. And that was something we had to negotiate, but that has already made a difference. It reduced expenses tremendously, and it also put in place some better productivity expectations. And so their numbers were already showing a dramatic increase in February. So that's something that made a difference. We did some restructuring as well with other programs that weren't doing as well, some merging of things. We're expanding. The state has never expanded residential beds, but they did this year, and we got 8 of them. Residential generally makes money very easily, so we were happy to do that and use the house that was actually empty for that expansion. So we expect that to make a significant difference in our bottom line in the next fiscal year. The biggest thing that we need to do, honestly, is start intakes in our clinic. We need to increase our client capacity. And that's something that is a priority, particularly for the clinic. We need to get our numbers back up there so that we have enough people to fill schedules as we expand. And that is something we'll be starting in the next month. It has taken time to onboard a bunch of new staff and train them. But that is our next priority. So we're trying to do it as quickly as we can, but recognizing and telling the board, this is going to take a long time. We're not going to be where we want to be probably for another year, is what we're thinking, what we're seeing. But we are, the last 2 months, we said the second half of the year, if what we put in place is doing what it's supposed to, that's when we'll see the change. And absolutely, January and February were very strong. And I'll see March soon. So we are hopeful that that is, the trend that we're seeing that we expected to see, and that should continue.
Well, thank you, Cari. Thank you, Dee. We have gone right up against our full scheduled hour. I want to thank everybody who joined us today. I also want to remind everyone that the slides and the recording for this will be made available on the Open Minds website starting tomorrow. And you can join us next week for our next roundtable, Thursday, April 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern, how to improve the performance of your existing whole person care, assessing your program positioning. To register for that event or to take a look at any of our other upcoming roundtables, you can visit the Executive Roundtables page under the Events tab, located at www.openminds.com. Cari, thank you again. Dee, it's been great.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care, everyone.